Hello, everybody. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to present myself first. I'm Santiago Miret, and I co-direct, together with Jorge Sarkis, the Master Art Program in Project Research at the University of Buenos Aires that is coordinated by Maria Laura Alvarez. This is such a pleasure for me to present Umemoto and Reiser. Whether they direct the internationally recognized architecture office, Reiser Umemoto. Their practice has been awarded many times and their work exhibited all around the globe. Recently, they built two major works of architecture. The first one in 2006, the O14 Tower in Dubai, more recently opening this year, the Taipei Pop Music Center in Taiwan. They are in the works of another major development also in Taiwan, the Kaohsiung Port and Service Center. And these astonishing structures are the outcome of years of theoretical and engaged architectural practice, together with an insatiable need for novel tectonics developments, both in practice and academia. Reiser Umemoto means for at least an entire generation of architects an heroic and absolutely convinced practice of the potential of architecture as a cultural achievement. For more than 30 years, they have participated in the contemporary disciplinary discussion and, without a doubt, are inscribed in the history of architecture as one of the most influential offices in the new century. With participation in paradigmatic competitions during the 1990s, such as the Cardiff Bay Opera House or the Yokohama Port Terminal, as well as with the publication of essential essays and books for contemporary practice, such as the acclaimed Atlas of Novel Tectonics, the office has positioned itself in a place of absolute reference. The recent work only demonstrates that the commitment and sincere dedication to a practice that is definitely consistent with its determination for the problematization of contemporary culture is the best undertaking that architecture office can carry out. So it is for me a pleasure to introduce you, Jessie. It's a pity that Nanako can't be with us today. I hope she gets well soon. And thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, Santiago, for introducing me. Yes, I mean, Nanako sends her regrets that she's a bit under the weather today, so I'm going to have to somehow fill in her place and, deliver a lecture of the same quality that she is, very capable of. Oh, I have to share a screen up here. Yeah. Okay. I'll jump right into it. Santiago mentioned that we've been practicing both as teachers and designers and architects for over 30 years, and so 2 years ago, we struggled really to put together a book that, while it's not a summation of all of our work, would try to tackle the kind of layered and difficult relationship between how we design, how we theorize, and how we practice. And it was actually quite surprising for us because we thought at first that it could be fairly straightforward, but the entanglements one gets into immediately, suggest, many possible ways of working. And so I have been inspired. Of course, one of my favorite films, Citizen Kane, is an attempt in its own way within the medium of film to tackle what it means, to represent someone's life or a partnership's life. And so we moved to, rather than an encyclopedic model, something that we intuitively are drawn to, and this is the kind of cabinet of curiosities. So in a way, the book has no overarching systematic kind of outline, but rather is connected across a series of parallel investigations and interests And similar to a cabinet of curiosities, and because we're architects and love, images and things, to kind of coalesce around things that, inspired us, that, either from the outside, from within the discipline, or, within our work, would serve as nuclei to start to unpack and unfold the various sort of strands of the office's work and of all our collaborators. So yeah, there is no overarching schema, but rather, I guess, a set of vital nuclei for us. But one thing that, in retrospect, we began to identify, and it actually began to give more clear form to our work, was that, say, instead of approaching a practice of architecture, as incidental or solving problems particular to every project that one engages, that rather there are certain consistencies, again, that one finds retrospectively, that connects across projects and across years. And they, in our case, many times these so-called sustained projects are concurrent in the office. So the first one, which I won't go into too much depth today, has to do with an assignment that John Haydock gave us at the Cooper Union to start a thesis. And very interesting. It was, in the books, of course, by the school, but, some really fascinating drawings of musical instruments were made by the students, starting in the late 80s. It lasted for a number of years. John never really articulated clearly what the intention of those drawings would be relative to the thesis projects, but rather, following his kind of intuitive pathway, he realized that, the kind of logic of the musical instrument, its relationship to the body, its relationship to a history of music and of sound, would resonate potentially, very deeply with the practice of architecture. And so it was a kind of mystery for me. I actually didn't ever do the drawing, but I watched them being done. I was completely, taken in by them, just by their sheer beauty at first. And then I realized that it was something that kind of kept reappearing in our own work. It was a desire to somehow reach the same level of complexity, of relationships, and of beauty that I found in those drawings. The others were the textual projects. I won't go into that so much, but they also had a duration of about 10 years, starting with our first work in the 80s and more or less wrapping up in the mid-90s. The surface project, which is not an internal project, but that was rather something that was of great interest within the discipline, starting certainly with the work of OMA and then down to the work of people coming out of the OMA office, was something that we got particularly excited about. And interesting to me too that there are these internal projects, I guess, to an office, but then there are also disciplinary projects that for their certain lifespan captivate certain practitioners in the discipline. So I'll be kind of opening up that. The surface project spawned an internal project in the office, which lasted 17 years, the Rodnet project. And then an overall kind of catch-all, the material project, also was a kind of long duration. But to give a kind of an accelerated version of what I mean, of how concepts and ideas migrate, one could point to this fascinating set of drawings at first that were generated by Cecil Valmond and his team. for the structural geometry of Toyo Ito's Serpentine Pavilion. Now, Baumann was more focused in on the lines and how those geometries might, create a series of overlapping structural bents for the pavilion. He sends the facts to Toyo Ito. Ito deliberately misreads the line network, is much more interested in everything in between. So he literally colors in the spaces between the lines and renders them as volumes in the pavilion. And then, 9 years later, Su Fujimoto, who was assisting Ito during the Serpentine, revisits Baumann's geometry on a project, far larger and also constrained by a triangular site. But it's basically a reinvestigation, not so much about the spaces in between, but back, to the overlapping structural geometry. So one can see the, the continuation of a series of very precise geometrical and structural investigations, and how they cross multiple practices. So yeah, this is really more or less a kind of breakdown of some of the projects in our office, again, concurrent, and I'll go into those in a moment. Santiago mentioned the importance of competitions, and especially in the 90s, I think they were really terribly important for young architects working on speculative projects. So I recall being completely blown away by FOA's competition scheme for the Yokohama Port Terminal. And of course, as a competitive architect, I also realized that there were certain things that could be addressed that were suggested by the FOA scheme, but that we could, do something else with the surface project. And so, coming a year later, the Kansai Library was in a way an answer to FOA's marvelous, project. And I got to think a little more clearly about this kind of relationship when we were invited to a panel at the Museum of Modern Art, which was sort of a discussion around a show about, I guess, 7 years ago now, called The Japanese Constellation. Now, MoMA, in the way it curates international shows, likes to focus in on, particular nations, and especially with Japan, the, very interesting lineage of architects, going from one architect to their disciple and to further disciples. And so that was more or less the structure of the MoMA show. And we said, wait a minute, that's perfectly fine if you circumscribe this kind of project within Japan, but in fact, there's a much larger linear of projects that went to Japan and enabled this little segment to happen. So we developed a kind of rough diagram of these kinds of lineages. So one could say that OMA fused, in a sense, the domino model of Corbusier with the continuous surface that one would find in even certain parking garage typologies to create a museum of movement or a library of movement based upon the sloping slab and the continuous surface. And then those interests are picked up later by MBRDV and of course FOA. And if we look a little more closely at the competition scheme that FOA put together. There's a very interesting kind of gap of years from the competition to the actual building. Alejandro Zaropolo and Farshid Mousavi initially collaborated with Cecil Baumann in London on the competition scheme, and they won. And when they came to actually build the project, it was realized that the kind of what they called the cardboard model, which was derived from Bauman's study of Le Récollet, wasn't going to span the distances necessary in the terminal. FOA moved to Kunio Watanabe, the Japanese engineer, and he basically applied another system on top, or below, I should say, the slab system. He kind of origami model was kind of hybridized with the surface model, and that was the building that ultimately was built. I should go back a second. The interesting thing is that engineers are competitive too, and Mitsuru Sasaki saw the finished project by FOA and said, the slabs are too fat. I want to make, kind of nail the problem of the continuous surface as being as ideally thin as possible, like the initial rendering. So in a way, it started a trajectory of design research in Sasaki's office, he collaborated with multiple architects to create the project, which was presented at MoMA, the Japanese constellation. Meanwhile, we actually, as I mentioned, we were doing a competition for the Kansai Library a year after the Yokohama Port Terminal, and we brought a similar set of problems to our engineer, a marvelous Cuban American engineer, Israel Sinek, who was also our professor of structures at the Cooper Union. And rather than make our library, the continuous slabs strong by attaching an origami to the slabs, he said, well, we'll separate the origami. We'll do a folded shell. It will do the structural work as a superstructure, and then we'll hang the slabs through a kind of loose grid of tension columns, of cables, and that will be the kind of solution, to keep the continuous surfaces thin and clear. So, a very similar intuition about using folded plates, but a very different way of, kind of suggesting their use. And so that initiated a whole set of projects that actually moved beyond the continuous surface in our office, that kept going. So it's that kind of intersection, I think, between overall projects in the field and then projects internal to the office, that bring a kind of, a certain vitality to the work of the office. And these kinds of projects, in a way, get exhausted after a certain amount of time. We basically bring the logic of this so-called RodNet project to a whole range of scales and demands. And so here are some of them. We basically assayed all the possible variations of using these kinds of systems where you have a superstructure and then hanging RodNet, and explored them in different programs. In a way, it's the package of logics that you would bring to a particular site and a particular program, and bring a kind of consistency to that direction of work. It's not unlike the way Mies van der Rohe would work, where he only had two logics for long span buildings, and then he would really systematically work through their permutations at various scales. And this slide just indicates that, in fact, the programs and the sites are completely different. And it's really about how you bring this set of relationships, of the RODNet system, in this example, to the particularities of site and program. So this is one of the, kind of the smallest versions of that idea, this agaponic house. And it allowed me, in the design, and we kind of work back and forth between what is presented in design and then kind of speculate and generate theory retrospectively based upon, what comes out of the design. Of course, I was reading Deleuze at the time, and so his distinction between chess and Go really resonated with the way we could approach this project. In other words, you could say that classical architecture would follow more or less the rules of chess. The identity of the pieces were quite stable, and there was a limited number of permutations possible within those logics. The Go pieces are very interesting because they have no stable identity. Rather that you have a kind of a generic piece, and based upon its relationships, it acquires a localized meaning, that can change. So made a kind of parallelism between, the little Go piece and then the rod of the RODNet. And, in the way that, say, Mies would move from his analysis of classical architecture in stone, asserting that the steel section, in a way, is one of those elemental pieces of order. We were dealing with a bunch of rods. And, part of the speculation which comes out in the Atlas for Novel Tectonics is that we operate in a way in between two logics. So if you have a Miesian sort of building where there's a clear hierarchy, structure and infill, we're interested in somehow locating our work between that and say, a structure like structural glass, where infill and structure are one and the same thing. And so that the most interesting area is that kind of in-between region, and that's where the RODNet lives. So in the house, we were exploring, the ways in which we would mobilize these rods, both as a purely decorative screen, which is everything that's hatched in red, and where we would, when you get to the enclosed volume of the house, when it's not kind of an outside screen, is suddenly mobilized as structure. And quantity also kind of has a bearing on this. So the structural engineer would hand us a determinate diagram like the one on the left, basically, the minimal number of rods that would hold, one could hang from the roof to hold the lower slab together. And then we deliberately increase the number, which technically speaking makes the structure more indeterminate, but it also has all kinds of super interesting byproducts optically. So you're no longer just talking about minimal structure, but these strange, transitions from more or less structural zones to zones that are probably operating more as an optical screen. But there were also kind of interesting impasses just in terms of design sensibility, which I talk to my thesis students a lot about, where if one were to work in a very pure way with the RODNet, there are moments like turning the corner, which are somehow, at least to my kind of way of working, intuitively felt inadequate. So I deliberately, inserted the Miesian corner in a non-functional way, to complete the corner with greater strength. I felt very guilty about that for years until, you know, I began to reflect that probably what I was doing was more in the line of the logic of Venturi, where, you know, one deals with a kind of an issue of contradiction in a project. So not, I guess I would say, formal postmodernism, but the arguments out of Venturi are really interesting when you move away from, you know, what it has been associated with. And again, this is not something I would start with in a design, but it was more through speculation after the design was complete. So, you know, this was a really interesting diagram. It was actually described in a book on acting, which in a way sums up this kind of situation where there's such a thing as presentational acting, where, you know, a tightrope walker is literally kind of dealing with the balance and the physics and what is presented as a kind of a body in poise. And then there's also representational acting, which they you know, outline as basically an actor acting like he's a tightrope walker on the ground. So in a way, we're working with both of those logics in our buildings. There's, one could say, presentational side, which would be the kind of, I know, the kind of the sheer and direct presence of the building and its physics. And then there's also the older, perhaps, representational side. And it's about, you know, working again between those two logics. So as an exercise for my students, I thought it would be interesting to compare the Sagaponic house to Corbusier's 5 points. And it was also, again, a very revealing kind of parallelism where, whereas, you know, Corbu very systematically separates out, you know, structure and, you know, all of the elements of the architecture, ours is always somehow poised in between the two. So the Sagaponic house is both up on pilotis, but there's also the kind of older ground-based elements of the house as well. So it's both up in the air and grounded. The structure is both well, it's mixed with the facade. So it's no longer a distinct, say, strip window, but the strip window is also both optical and structural. So it would, you know, in a really uncanny way, begin to connect into a later kind of postmodernist way of looking at things. There have been a lot of discussions about the nature of the image, especially these days. I won't go into it in this talk, but suffice it to say, we also have begun to develop a way of thinking about when architecture is delivered within its sort of disciplinary logics, or when, as in many sort of politically oriented projects, it becomes yet another vehicle for communicating subject matter. And it's something that we have been, and I think this is especially true in the United States, given the kind of the upsurge of all kinds of social issues, how to kind of locate architecture. Is it purely a material practice? Does it, you know, possess some autonomy, or does it get meshed, even as in terms of image culture, in a wider kind of disciplinary and non-disciplinary conversation? So I'll just present, you know, a series of projects that we have been involved in, which was discussed in the introduction. our first major built project, we had a lot of small ones up to that point, and of course competition work. But the first major built project came out indirectly from a competition. It was a 22-story tower in Dubai, named 014 because the site is designated 014. And it was very interesting working remotely with a whole series of specialists. There are, a developer in Dubai. General contractor was a Palestinian. Formwork and glazing made in China. Lebanese architects of record. It was really a very interesting, and actually very rewarding process, kind of working through problems that, we had been sort of internally speculating on, but then how to make them real and how to deal with them, in a really pragmatic way, given the constraints of budget and time and so forth. So again, these were, some of the major, players on the project. The developer, Shahab Lutfi, invited us to a competition at first for a big central tower in an area of Dubai called Business Bay. We lost the competition to Zaha Hadid, but then when Shahab began his own practice as a developer, he was working with Dubai Properties when he did the competition, but he went off on his own as a developer, and he selected us to work with him. So the tower evolution I'll be going into in a second, but it's actually, a quite simple kind of soft cruciform plan. There's an concrete exoskeleton, which changes in thickness from 60 to 40 centimeters. And in addition to the tower floor plate, and I guess I should also say that the all of the gravity and lateral forces are taken by the drum of the exoskeleton. So the core could be relatively light. It was almost like a kind of nuclear reactor containment vessel, a very rigid structure. And then there was also the development of underground parking and things that we developed along the way in the design process. And one of the things that's quite typical in Dubai is that they will build, an outdoor parking structure at grade, which we thought, which was encouraged at first. And we were able to argue successfully that the parking structure could be, put into the basement because the site was very prominent, and it would also allow us to create a public space under this floating podium that would allow people to connect from a back street to a waterfront esplanade. And of course, our developer was very interested in, that it was very valuable space and very nice space so that he could justify the extra investment. But we were constantly, working with and against a master plan that was part of this whole development. So they wanted a podium base. We had to kind of argue for our podium base. They wanted arcades at the base of the building. And we argued that the shell of 014, if we reduced the size of the lobby, would act as an arcade. And so, all of this in the service of really trying to make connections, under and through the building. And we also were, taking up some of the suggestions that OMA made. They, for a short time, had control of the master plan. Ultimately, it was wrested away from them, but we thought it was a really fascinating possibility to create a second level continuous green space. So that was also a part of our plan, although I'm not sure if they ever really connected the buildings that way. But anyway, you get this lower podium building, which is then connected continuously to the open office plan. So it's really kind of an expansion of the offices, and it's all lifted up to allow, you know, movement under and through. And people use this space for exercise every night. There's a stack effect that I'll get into in a moment, but there's a continuous breeze generated by the building. And so they discovered this, and then they have these classes that are mainly, I think, they're mainly expats doing this kind of stuff. But yeah, the geometry was a large part of the project. This is an unfolded view of the shell, and you can perhaps see, very lightly these dashed lines. These are all the connections, between the outer shell and the inner slab, these sort of dashed elements, and then air is allowed to kind of circulate up and through. Again, the design process was not linear. The first iterations of the building, we thought we would put glazing in the holes. It was not good for a number of reasons. It would mean that you would have an enormous number of custom bent pieces of glass, depending upon where on the geometry these would fall. And also what I thought were pretty ugly frames that would then further kind of close down the opening of the hole. So we moved from that to a solution where a simple window wall basically divided the inside from the outside. The exoskeleton would then become really exo. It would, lose all of those windows. And it also, because the window wall had to be cleaned, we needed about 3 feet of space for that. So what that produced was this kind of this space in between glazing and shell, which became, actually operated in a very strong way with the stack effect, which then, our MEP engineers told us would reduce the cooling costs. It's not a heating problem, but a cooling problem by about 30%. So what we started with, yes, was a kind of brise soleil, and we were, interested in that. But the stack effect feature actually came indirectly as a result of other operations in the design. So yeah, this as an aside, really, I mean, there's great interest, and quite rightfully so, about creating sustainable buildings, sustainable architecture. I would say that we have to be very careful about what we mean by sustainable. In other words, I have these 2 buildings here, both of which were kind of designated LEED Platinum buildings. The architecture couldn't be more different. So to be strict about it, you can, and I think this is actually a good thing, almost any architecture is susceptible and can be made sustainable, that there is no one, say, sustainable style. And I think it also has to do with this peculiar scalar question, right? I mean, sustainability becomes significant when you have statistically significant quantities of buildings that do it. So in a way, those kinds of logics fall outside of the specificity of the architecture. That's really more of a performance value than it is an architectural value. Granted, a performance value that's important. But, you see, I would say almost ad nauseum, buildings that will, I guess you could argue, are more about advertising their sustainable features. And whether or not you need to do that to make a sustainable building is an entirely different question. But it's more about the sheer quantity of projects that would make a significant contribution to an environmental problem, not really the specific architectural problem. So anyway, to get back to 014, we worked on many kind of exercises dealing with the specific geometry of all of the formwork and how they lay on the shell, and whether they would be reusable or not. Ultimately, it was decided that these would all be waste molds, that there was, it would be too costly to reuse the formwork, and much faster, simply to fabricate new ones on site. And the timeline for construction, because it was a learning process, this was really a new building, the first stories took approximately 3 weeks to do, and by the end of the project, about 1 week to do a story. So there were a lot of things to work through. So it spoke, I would say, also to the willingness of the entire team to take risks, to try something new, and the just the enthusiasm, working together on something that wasn't so standard. So these are views on the base, in the lobby, and some of the views from within the offices. So, some of the openings are quite big, multi-story openings, other, gradient down to a very kind of small scale opening. And then this is a view of the roof of 014 where the shell emerges free. Okay, I'm going to go to a completely different scale of project now. This was a project that I was involved in with the historian and theorist Daniel Lopez, who works out of San Diego. We designed a show based upon the work, his research work for the book on Buckminster Fuller. And he, in fact, built a whole series of constructions called geoscopes, one of which was actually built at the School of Architecture at Princeton in the early 60s. And these were to be, at the time, of course, they didn't have computers that could kind of replicate changes in the world, but these were, in a way, the first kind of baby steps at representing both the world as a globe, but also because of Fuller's ideology and interests, the kind of parallelisms and analogies of his geodesic structures down to the micro scale. So yeah, these are some shots of that construction with the students at Princeton. And I only had a very short time to read really part of Daniel Lopez's book, and there was an enormous amount of material that Daniel wanted to present, and I couldn't see, pasting Xeroxes to the wall. So we came up really not knowing so much about the geoscopes with essentially a new version of a geoscope, which would be an inflatable where you would have back kind of projections. And so I was also looking at biology, at these sort of hollow, in embryology, the blastula, the kind of hollow balls of cells that happen at a certain stage of development. created graphics too. And then, so we came up with a spherical, elevated spherical device. This is pre-COVID. And the idea was that the students could crawl inside, like 3 or 4 of them at once, on a kind of an illuminated contour couch, and then watch the exhibition projected on the inside pillows. We didn't want to repeat a Fuller-esque geodesic, so we kind of started with his interest in the primary solids and then began to superimpose the dodecahedron with the icosahedron, finally kind of creating a field of points, and then produced a Voronoi pattern, which would, kind of, we mirrored it, and then we created this Voronoi pattern, rather like a complex soccer ball, that would also, be less regular, perhaps closer to the way reticulations work in natural form, and that would be our pillow field that we would project against. It was also inspired by these amazing photographs of the first atomic bomb, with the spheres covered with wires and sensors and all of the other things necessary, and we were going to get a similar effect. So this was, the kind of the first inflatable part. The top is inflatable. The bottom is actually a kind of cradle that could carry the heavy weight, of people inside. And we were exploring various translucent materials as well to illuminate the interior of it. So there was a welded cradle below and then inflatable above. And you can see this chandelier-like structure above. Portholes were made with photo filters. And then ultimately we were able to project, very high resolution images from behind at these pillows. And there were, there was sound and light and a film on Fuller. It was really quite effective. So we were invited to the Venice Biennale, which should open in a little less than a month. And because of COVID rules, the geoscope had to be split in half so people could walk through. And so that's what we're working on now. And instead of the Fuller material, we've asked a whole series of contemporary voices, in a way, a kind of group speaking all at once, but then also speaking as separate presentations. So it'll be Babel-like, but it will also then be a series of particular shows. But it's really an interdisciplinary collaboration. So we work on a lot of different scales and things. This is the Taipei Music Center, which is almost completed. The main hall is completed, but it was a competition started about 10 years ago. And it was really to create a new kind of area of Taipei dedicated to popular music, its production and reception. We were really interested not so much in the context buildings, because it was an old factory site, everything was going to be torn down, but rather just the amazing kind of relationship of nature being close to these foothills and mountains, and how our project would relate to that aspect of the context, more so than the kind of industrial site. And so it's in an area of Taipei that's undergoing a lot of restoration and development now, called Nangang. It's along a kind of major subway line. The site is actually 2 sites, a very long, narrow site, which has, will have the Cube, which is a museum and cafe, and then the industry shell, which is really a production facility, and then finally the main performance hall. And the idea too was to think of this project as having two horizons, one, the ground, and then also an elevated artificial ground, which upon which three of these object buildings would sit. So these were all tied together with bridges, and there was a whole kind of mandate in Taipei for that kind of elevated circulation. So it suggested, thinking of the project as occupying really two different datums. And so there's the live houses, there's a very large open outdoor plaza, which would serve as an outdoor performance space. And as I mentioned, the main hall, the 5,000 seat main hall. We worked through a lot of physical models. It's not something we have abandoned at all, but both handmade and digital are really mixed up in the studio. And this is a view of the main hall. It's actually, in terms of scale, very similar to Bernard Shumi's Limoges Concert Hall. It's both 5,000 seat halls, but we were, as I said, interested not in the kind of massive vertical building coming out of the ground, but that rather the building was deliberately split sectionally between a kind of groundwork and then the kind of object building that sat on top of the groundwork. So here are some views in construction. And you can just, I guess you can't really see it too well, but this sort of groundwork contained all of the kind of service functions, especially in the back, all of the loading elements and, for sets and other, kinds of equipment that would feed the back of the hall. And then the other building sort of perches on top. So at grade, there is a major entrance for red carpet events, and then the general public would use both that level, but also the elevated level as they cross the bridge from across the street. The issue of the silhouette of the building was really crucial, I would say. I mean, not that we were trying deliberately to kind of mimic Japanese or classical buildings, but I was fascinated by the kind of the presence of those, kinds of roofs on the skyline to me. And then this view on the left shows more of the groundwork. This is actually behind that concrete vault is the press room for the theater. So it's really conceived of as a kind of nested series of envelopes, the outer exterior shell, what we call the interior crystal, which surrounded the performance hall on the outside. And then the idea that those bridges that are so omnipresent in Taipei would be made coextensive with the inside. So as you walked across the bridge, you would naturally kind of go into all of the mezzanines and all of the routes into the main hall. It was one continuous bridge. Some early images of the structure, and then the cladding. And again, we're very interested in how this building then relates to the kind of geography of the site, that being in a way more permanent than the other buildings, around it. And I was also, really fascinated with the kind of peculiar metal treatments that are available in Asia. And specifically, there's a kind of anodizing called alumite that was used and is used in Japan. It was first developed for aircraft, actually, because it, at least the claim was that it would reflect light and form a kind of camouflage depending upon the state of the weather and the humidity conditions better than a silver plane. So I thought that could be a really interesting way of thinking through the cladding for the building. I was also, because I have my obsession about aircraft, and corrugated metal is many times associated with cheap building, I was interested in the opposite, actually, of looking at precedents and examples where extreme craft is used. This is actually a picture in the Junkers factory in the 1930s where corrugated metal was pushed to its limits. All kinds of details and conditions were addressed using the corrugated metal technologies. So we kind of brought that kind of interest to the way the skin was detailed in 014, in the music center. This is a view of the lower lobby. And this, very compressed space between the envelope and then the inner crystal was also, a very kind of exciting thing to study for us. This was a photo taken during one of the kind of initial rehearsals, but you get a sense of the scale of the building. You see the crowd, coming in, on that bridge. And then this is a view of the main kind of performance hall. So yeah, in a way, I was also revisiting, some of the arguments of my teachers, specifically Aldo Rossi, with whom I worked in the late 70s and in the mid 80s. And one of the things that I remember him relating was the kind of persistence of forms in the city. So, as an example, the Circus Agonalis took, 1,500 years to become the Piazza Navona, but its trace, is felt in the mark of the city. And so we did a kind of accelerated version of that for the music center, where over the course of a day, the project would kind of shift from being a kind of circus at night for performance, but then would turn into a shopping plaza, with restaurants, cafes, and so forth during the day. So it was in a way kind of touching on, very new things and also very old things. This is yet to be occupied. They have to get tenants. So these are kind of some initial views. They did have some events there. And this is kind of looking down the long axis from this cube museum. This is Nanako in front of that museum. This is a Hall of Fame, has archives, and various kinds of exhibitions in it. But again, it's, perched on this elevated ground. Okay, and now I'll speak a little bit about the project, which is probably will be completed by the end of next year, the Kaohsiung Port Terminal. It was, like many projects, a planning project, as well as an specific architectural design project. But the Port of Kaohsiung, is still the most important and active container port in Taiwan. And the Port of Authority wanted a new tower. And then there was also a demand for a major cruise ship terminal, in a way, a sister building to the Yokohama Port Terminal. So the ships that kind of go to Yokohama will also visit this site. And, we were interested both in the kind of specific object of the architecture, let us say, but also in its sort of location on the edge, the necessity of, keeping this site. Well, the demand really was to bring the general public to this site and to use the edge. But then the problem was that it's still a very active, port. It's not a post-industrial site. So we argued for a kind of, again, two datums that would contain the general public on an upper level, and then the functions of the port and all of those uses on a lower level. So these are some views. One of the main kind of arguments we had was that everything should be clearly visible when you enter the different cruise ship terminal spots, as well as, and this is a view, I guess very quickly, on the public esplanade that would ideally continue along the entire edge. So yeah, different scales and types of ships will be used by this terminal, domestic ferries as well as large international cruise ships. And so it represents a kind of major investment and was part of a kind of a larger master plan for this kind of site in Taiwan. So you can see other buildings. There's a pop music center and other public buildings which are now being built along this working waterfront. So of course we have no control over any construction outside of our site, but the idea is that that elevated esplanade would continue and make the link. And so this was, in a way, more part of our master plan for that whole edge and its connectivity, along the edge, as well as to, kind of different areas of Kaohsiung City. There was a major problem that was encountered, and it was part of, the kind of deep material history of that site. This was a storage facility first by the Japanese Imperial Navy when they, occupied Taiwan. So there were kind of major oil storage tanks on the site, which leached petroleum into the ground. That had to be cleared up, and it took 3 years for that to happen. We found actually the original Mitsubishi tanks, made during the 20s and 30s for the Navy. That was our site. And I was actually able to find the bombing maps. So T4 is our site, and that contained those Mitsubishi tanks and was bombed by the US, and then China Petroleum put new tanks up after the war. Those also leached into the ground. So it was a really, a kind of historical soup that had to be removed, from the site before construction could begin. And organizationally, we made very clear distinctions between the service functional level at grade, the terminal level, which had to be, distinct from the general public. That was kind of in the middle of the sandwich, and then this public esplanade. And so that kind of logic, in a kind of tripartite way, sectionally runs through the project. The blue being the public esplanade, the middle level, the terminal, and then all of the kind of grade service functions in yellow. And we were, had been exploring the sort of model of the tri-lobe structure, which began with theatrical design, but we saw could actually, almost by turning the arrows the other direction, from the theater, where they would say converge at the stage, if one were looking outwards, you could easily, like in optics, reverse the arrows, and views and people could go the other direction. So what started with a kind of theatrical plan actually gave us the logic for the port terminal. And we took very much advantage of thick walls of poche, of putting all of the vertical circulation into in between the walls to keep the spaces relatively, clear and clean. Just an argument about, the kind of directed space of our project as opposed to a gridded space, columnar space. And, the fact that at different levels, you can actually kind of enter the space and see what's going on, but not connect. So, I mean, that has to do also with the clean zones that are necessary with ticketed passengers versus the general public. So one could go, like an airport section, really, could go directly from the drop off to the ship. If you had more time, you could go up to a restaurant, which would also be accessible, to those who are on the boardwalk. And, you leave the ship and go down and out like in an airport. But this kind of panoramic view was really meant to kind of show that you could basically see where you had to go upon entry from whatever direction, it was very kind of clear. Some images in construction of the waiting space. They're kind of developing all the structure and now all the secondary structure and cladding for the roof. This is up on the boardwalk. Again, the kind of second level poche kind of theater. So enormous amount of time working on all of the specifics of the detailing of the cladding and the glazing and so forth. This is a view of one of the floors in the tower. Again, it's for the Port of Authority of Kaohsiung. So it's one tenant. This is a special club, which one enters through the poche in the wall. And then a kind of speeded up version of construction that the contractor did. And that ends my talk.
Okay. Just
be happy to
yes.
take any questions or.
Yeah, sure. I already let the people know that you can write your questions in the Q&A button that you have in the bottom of the screen, and also you can raise your hand using the bottom hand, so I can activate your microphone and speak directly. It's amazing to see all this material. Thank you very much. It's kind of overwhelming, all this incredible work that you have done. In the meantime that people is writing their questions, maybe I can open with one. I don't know if I'm strictly correct about this, but maybe you can illuminate me. But there's something about continuous in your form, the problem of the continuity, that it's kind of strange. I mean, maybe the Kaohsiung may seem absolutely continuous at first glance, but when you see in detail, there's not strictly every curve is not strictly continuous with another one, and this is something that in other projects it's more evident, but maybe in Kaohsiung it's kind of hidden, right? But that's something that makes, I believe that's something that makes the way you work with geometry quite interesting, because it makes it weird, right? It's not everything continuous.
Yes.
It makes you wonder. So can you elaborate on these decisions that you made that
Sure.
make things not perfectly continuous?
Right. Well, I think it kind of goes back to the dilemma. I mean, I guess it has to do with the degree to which a single sort of thesis would rule the project, and bringing in ways of working, which I guess the discontinuities could be more associated with a modernism, you know, articulating difference, or, you know, like when we put the Mesian corner into the, you know, Sagaponic. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a kind of battle in a way between whether, I mean, even before I conceptualized it, it was just a kind of sensibility question. Like, I wasn't satisfied with the pure expression of one concept, and it needed, I felt the corner needed more emphasis. And so, you know, how to reconcile those things was, you know, a problem. And it was, yeah, so that you might be picking up on that. But I mean, I guess I then say, well, that fits perfectly into a kind of Venturi-esque argument, that it's both and, or, you know, that you get contradiction in the project, that the pure concept was never, well, I actually didn't say that in a way, the work of Sasaki with the Japanese led to a pure expression of a, you know, a continuous structural surface without anything added. And I actually thought that in a way, the port terminal that Alejandro and Farshid built, where it was a kind of strange composite between an origami and the continuous surface, was more successful architecturally, even though it was less conceptually pure.
Right. Yeah, even in the Taipei,
so it's, yeah, what you're interested in, like the kind of contradiction of what you're interested in and what you like, I guess, right, is operating too.
Well, in the Pop Center, you can also look at the buildings by themselves, right? Like the buildings, the three buildings work perfectly by themselves, but also sharing some kind of continuity that, in a way, integrates them, but kind of in this weird way that you're
right. I mean, that's been sort of characteristic of our practice from the beginning. Yeah. I always, you know, it's not complete continuity. Actually, the continuity, nice, even in the, you know, in the library is framed by a hard edge and it stops. And that right. was really interesting to me. That it, I mean, it was actually a criticism by Stephen Hall of the FOA scheme that they had trouble putting railings on it.
Right.
And I thought that was super interesting. I actually liked the idea that it would be a completely different, you know, system. It wouldn't be an excuse, but yeah.
Okay, we have a question here. I'm going to read it to you. Maximiliano asks, I wonder if, considering the role that plays the project of the history of the discipline in your whole practice, you could briefly explain the relationship between norm, variation, and invention.
Oh, let me look at that.
It's quite a question.
Between the relationship between norm, variation, and invention. Wow. Okay. I think, I mean, I can't put any hard and fast rules in terms of where one kind of engages norms, where variation is deployed, and where invention happens. I mean, I guess I could say that in a way, the norms are really useful. I mean, if one could say like the norms of program, let's say, you know, that's not something invented by us, but given to us, provide a kind of useful constraint against uncontrolled invention or variation, you know, that those, or, you know, just simply the physical constraints of a site, all the things that you don't really invent, but that are sort of placed on you, become useful constraints on those other, you know, ways of working. I don't know if that's an adequate answer to the question, but I think, you know, I think always kind of shuttling back and forth, I think, between, you know, things that are not created by you, but which exist as norms, are things that you would both work within or push against. But it's useful to have them.
Right. Okay. We have another one here. Maria Laura asks, in the process of design, do you attend about the way of appearing of the building and its effects in people as urban landmarks?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I have to look at it too. Sorry. Yes, very much. I mean, I think it was the whole question of appearance and the effect of the building as a landmark. Well, first of all, both of the major competitions we were involved in Taiwan explicitly demanded, for better or worse, that the building be iconic. And so it was really, even the Dubai project, and maybe that's a function of the time period of those competitions, but those were requirements. So then it was the problem, you know, what does it mean to do something iconic? What's a good icon or a bad icon? That was, you know, one of the problems. The other thing was, you know, with something like the Pop Music Center, we were told that, you know, much of its reception would actually, much of it might not ever be embodied, but it would have to be recognizable on other media. And so, you know, the way in which we, you know, very deliberately created those three object buildings was kind of formed along that as well. So it would be, you know, a project that would be very clearly defined by those special object buildings on those grounds, both in the site, you'd orient yourself to them, but also their appearance, you know, given it was at the time when social media was just starting. But that was also part of, you know, the demand of the brief. It was, you know, part of the contemporary. Generally, I guess I would say that, you know, I would be more inclined, and maybe that has to do with that thing I outlined really quickly about presentational and representational. I'm more interested in the presentational stuff, but there's also the kind of byproduct of the, you know, presentational, which is representational. But there are others who are probably more interested in just, you know, kind of pure image culture, which is never, you know, has never been a kind of primary concern of mine. But the buildings throw off all of that stuff as kind of secondary effects, I would say.
Right. When you were presenting some projects in architecture, you talk about a musical instrument project, a textile project, surface project, etc. Is there a movie project, a film project because I know that film is very present. You briefly present the Kurosawa and briefly Citizen Kane. I don't know, you work with this material. We may say, is there a film project someplace there?
Oh, sure. I mean, definitely inspired by, certain images from film. So the whole issue of the silhouette maybe starts with painting, but it also, is very evident in, certain Japanese films where you see those kinds of silhouettes on the horizon, or even a similar one out of the bunker scene, for example, in Saving Private Ryan, which is also terrifying. It's sort of a terrifying figure on the horizon. And yeah, so yeah, they're definitely interested in that. Also in, the strange difference between, if you visit a pagoda, for example, in Japan, what its effects are under those eaves when you go there, as opposed to the photographic image of them, has been a particular fascination for me. That they acquire a style in photographs, but they somehow lose that sense of expression and style when you actually visit one of them.
It has something to do with shape.
They're less flat. I guess once they're flattened into an icon, then they somehow acquire a clearer sense of style, and you don't get, but it's a peculiar, interesting kind of difference between going to an actual building versus images of buildings. Yeah.
Well, there is something nice that you said in the beginning that was about that we referring to your practice, love images, right? So it's nice to understand your interest in film when images kind of stuck or stop, stand still. Well, we have some technical question here. Micaela asks, on your last project, where there are instances where the structure forced you to change the final shape of the building. That structure forced you to change the final shape of the building in Kaohsiung?
Kaohsiung, the peculiar thing about the Kaohsiung project is that it hardly changed from the competition, to the final building. And in a way, I give credit to Israel Sinek, who was our structural engineer. He passed away. It was the last project before he died. He didn't even see the competition get presented. So both in its sort of form, but also the structure, it hardly changed. On the other hand, Taipei Pop changed radically. But it was more, not so much, the structure sort of followed a massive change in the program from the competition, to the design development. They increased the size of the theater by almost double. And we had a completely other scheme with a robot and all this stuff. And that was out of the question in terms of budget. So, but it was really due to, programmatic factors and the client that the form and structure changed, not so much, whether the structure changed the project per se.
Right. Well, maybe we have one more. One is asking about the grandiloquence of these projects. He asks how architecture and its users should interact to prevent grandiloquence of the form from becoming uninhabitable.
I don't know. That's a hard question to answer. I mean, I don't know. You could say that Milan Cathedral is grandiloquent, but it's perfectly inhabitable. So I don't know if it's so much a kind of conflict between, I don't know, strong gestures and habitability. But I think it also, maybe it relates to the way in which, you kind of go down into detail, and that it wouldn't, the architecture wouldn't be adequate simply as a, I don't know, a large scale cartoonist gesture, but that, part of its engagement has to do with a very direct material engagement at scale. And so, it wouldn't be enough simply to do a grandiloquent gesture, but that, attention would be paid to the way people use it and engage it and how they sit in it and move through it and so forth, which I think is very important to us. I mean, I was trained, my mother is an architect, she's still practicing. So I was actually trained in a way as a kind of a straight modernist. And then, I blame my education for what happened. But those kinds of concerns, I'm working at the residential scale for her. And, she belongs to that generation that would design down to the silverware. Is part of both my background and Nanako, who comes out of furniture design. So, I think that's an important kind of dimension to our experience. And I hope that it somehow is reflected in the work.
Okay, so with that, I think we can wrap up.
Okay.
I'm so grateful for this. Thank you very much. It's been great.
Absolute pleasure.
To see the work. You've been so generous showing these projects, and thank you very much. And thank the people that connected and follow this through Facebook. It's been a pleasure, Jesse, and my best to
pleasure. I long to go back to Argentina and to Buenos Aires.
Okay, we hope we can make that a reality soon.
Okay.
So thank you very much,
Okay.
Jesse.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
See you later. Bye-bye.